I need to vent about a situation I'm currently dealing with. My stalker, Fridge Guy. I'm a GFE escort, which stands for Girlfriend Experience. A GFE is basically a booking where the escort brings more intimacy and a genuine easygoing feeling to the appointment. We didn't have a lot in common, but I did find mental health struggles and politics were at least something we could bond over. Last June, he booked his first appointment with me. Since then, he's seen me 14 times, usually around once a month, always in 1-hour increments. He's expressed interest on seeing me outside of work as well, but I declined that. Over the past year, he's gradually escalated in terms of offers to help me outside of work. I didn't want this help, as I didn't want to encourage the strings that would be attached to it. He also started writing me these letters that he'd hand me at the end of each session. I never returned this gesture though. He'd bring a few odd gifts, but nothing that I would have wanted or asked for. A couple of times this was actually quite annoying when I had to figure out what to do with them. Something like a large crate of cat food that my cat can't even eat. I was already thinking that I might need to end our interactions altogether due to him obviously getting too close. But things really started going poorly when he lost his job in May. In the following weeks, he expressed to me he thought there was a conspiracy to get him fired, as well as a conspiracy to sabotage all his interviews at other companies. I pointed out that if everybody was declining him, perhaps there was something he needed to work on. I also pointed out that maybe he should stop seeing me until he procured another source of income. At this point, I was very uncomfortable being the entirety of the locus of his happiness, especially if it was going to start making the rest of his life worse, which would only amplify that issue and make it harder for him to recover. He also kept coming to see me at work while he was sick as well. I ended up getting sick after that. This seems pretty minor, but it was a red flag that his desires trumped my need for safety and health. Things all came to a head when he brought a whole goddamn refrigerator to my work. As you can expect, because of the legality of my work, it's essential to be discreet and inconspicuous. Bringing a damn fridge to the parking lot outside my work is the exact opposite of that. I told him I couldn't accept it, and listed off I had no means of transporting this big-ass fridge home anyway. His response was that he would drive it to my house, or perhaps we could take a road trip to give it to my mother. This was quite alarming. I'd never done anything to make him think this was something that could possibly happen. In fact, I'd specifically made sure to disabuse him of any of these ideas as they came up in the past. Anything like dinners, stuff like that. At that point, I had decided to ban him altogether. He was clearly out of touch with reality, and was imposing his fantasies onto me to a dangerous level. Before I emailed him to end things, he also sent me an email offering me his credit card info so I could buy the fridge online since I couldn't take it in person. This was clear obsession. At the end of June, I sent him an email trying to very gently break things off. Actually, I recommended that he speak more to his therapist and see if possibly they could adjust his meds. I knew the meds he was on could cause symptoms of schizophrenia, like his paranoia that he was developing. I also suggested he be much more careful and explained how dangerous it was to offer his credit card info to someone he paid to pretend to care about him. I'm not sure if he followed up with those things at all. Instead, this is when shit completely hit the fan. Initially, he was just banned from booking me, but he repeatedly called, emailed, and left messages non-stop at my agency for me specifically, and it quickly went into a blanket ban altogether. At that point, he began searching for providers I work with outside of our agency to avoid our screening process and get past the ban. He kept on asking if any provider-client relationships had ever turned into real ones, and they very firmly shut that down. Thankfully, those providers also informed me of what was happening. Our boss sent him an email telling him to kindly knock it off. Then he got angry and threatening. During a back and forth, he seemed to have convinced himself that my boss was preventing me from responding to him, and it was all her fault. This was, of course, not the case. She called him out on it, and it seemed like she'd gotten through to him. I didn't hear from him at all until about 2 weeks ago on November 20th. He showed up under a brand new name with an appointment for me. I'm not sure if he was waiting for a strategic opportunity, but the only reason I opened the door was because it was raining that night and he was using his umbrella to completely block his face. Under any other circumstances, I would have never opened that door. Because of the rain, I stepped out to hold it open while he squeezed inside with his umbrella. When he lowered it and I saw who he was, I stepped back, and that put me outside the door with him blocking my way back in. Fuck me for trying to be courteous, right? He kept on saying he wanted to apologize in person. He just needed the opportunity. Then he asked me to not screw it up for him with the other girls. That was particularly insulting. He was the one screwing his chances because of his terrifying actions. I just kept telling him to leave, over and over and over again. He tried to grab me as I squeezed past him, but I somehow managed to dodge it. He had taken all this time to make up a brand new identity and see outside providers just so that one could give him a reference that would get him through our screening and wouldn't be flagged by any of his banned info. This terrified me. During the time that he'd made the new account with us was around the time we banned him the first time. I thought he'd moved on and let things go, but it turns out he's literally never stopped obsessing and trying to find a way to get to me. I felt unsafe taking on any new clients since then. This has had an incredibly detrimental impact on my mental health, as well as an impact on my bottom line since I felt unsafe taking on new clients. The next step for me may have to be a restraining order. I worry about how he would respond and escalate though. I never thought he would stalk me for months and months, so clearly I can't trust he won't do something worse. Out of concern for his safety as well, I tried to end things gently, but at this point it may need to be reinforced that I want nothing to do with him and never have. I would never and will never want to spend time without being paid, and not even that anymore. I don't like him sexually, and it's my skill at my job that allowed me to find some small common ground with him, not any true connection or friendship. I'm trying to get in contact with a psychiatrist, so maybe he can intervene medically before I have to get the law involved. This happened 2 days ago. I live in a small city in Romania, about 30,000 inhabitants or so. Romania isn't exactly known for their tolerance of gay people. It's not quite as bad as other places like Russia, but the situation is definitely not rosy here either. I get on Grindr and meet this guy, 18 years old apparently. The guy didn't have a picture of his face on his profile pic. Makes sense because it's too dangerous around here. He had a picture of a rose drawing instead. Most guys on Grindr here don't have pictures of themselves. We talked for a bit and I really liked the guy. Finally, we accept to exchange facial pictures. I sent him a selfie of myself, and he sent me a picture of a guy from our city. He was very cute, and I really liked him. So I told him, "Hey, I've seen you around the city before. I didn't know you were gay too." We talked and finally arranged to meet. I had some errands to run at the tailor shop. My cousin's bachelorette party was coming next week, and I had to adjust my favorite shirt. I asked the guy to meet me in front of the tailor shop. The building in which this shop was located had 4 stories. The ground floor was a clothes shop which my aunt worked at. The first floor was a storage room. The third floor a barber's salon, and the 4th floor the tailor shop. I go up to the shop and then go down to the clothes shop on the ground floor to visit my aunt after and see how she's doing. As I happened to glance out the window of that clothes shop, I noticed there were 5 men waiting around, all of them in their late 20s behind the building. Not a single one of them was the guy I'd gotten a picture of, and none of them even remotely looked close to what he looked like either. I texted the guy I was supposed to meet and asked him if he'd made it to the shop already. As soon as I sent the message, one of those 5 men's phones lit up and he started texting me back. As soon as that guy finished texting, I got a notification from Grindr. "Hey, yeah, I'm right behind the tailor shop. I went outside to smoke where no one would see me. Come on, come smoke with me." I was terrified as I realized I was never going to meet that guy in the picture. The guy tried to get me to go behind the tailor shop. I tried to convince him and his buddies to go to the side of it instead. There were no windows to the side of the building, so after a few tries he agreed to meet me there. All 5 of them went around to the side. I peeked my head out the door, looked left and right to make sure, and as soon as I saw it was clear, I ran for it. I actually bumped into the cute guy the next day and started talking to him. I opened my phone and pretended to use it, and I actually went on Grindr at that time. I saw him look over at my screen and ask me, "You're, you know." I said yes, because I kinda got the feeling he was gay too. He said me too. I told him about what had happened with those guys, and he got really scared because those guys had used his picture and he didn't know anything about it. On a more positive note though, he agreed to go out with me when school starts up again, so that's something to look forward to. This happened to me 4 years ago. It's by far the most extreme and life-threatening situation I've ever been in. The eyewitness account you are about to read is 100% true and 100% mine as well. For some understanding, this happened in the United States during the summer of 2012. My longtime boyfriend and I had just recently gotten married. Even though we were dirt-poor college students and lived in a dinky apartment, we were having a blast. This particular summer, we gathered with our friends at the local movie theater almost every weekend. There was one just down the street from our apartment that had really cheap movie tickets. A night out was just under $10, and that was certainly within our budget. Anyway, one Thursday night I received a call from this group of friends, inviting us to watch the midnight premiere of the newest Batman movie. I had just finished working a 12-hour shift and was really tired. I almost refused the invitation and thought about just crashing in my apartment instead. I didn't really want to miss out on all the fun though, and it was a movie I'd wanted to see for a long time anyway. What harm could it do to stay up a little bit later than usual and just miss a few hours of sleep, right? At 10:30 we met at the theater. We passed large cardboard cutouts of Catwoman and Batman as we walked inside, greeted by the smell of buttery popcorn and the chatter of excited moviegoers. The ticket booth was to the right of the entrance, and just above that was an electronic list of movies being played. The 12 a.m. showing of The Dark Knight Rises was displayed up there in bright red letters. Being paranoid that tickets would sell out quickly, one of my friends swung by earlier that day and had purchased them for all of us. We bypassed the line and went straight to the ticket taker. She smiled at us and kindly directed us to Theater 9, which was on the right side of the lobby. If only I had known what I do now, that among those crowds a killer was lurking. That as I walked across that tacky red and purple carpet towards Theater 9, I could have very well been walking straight to my death. I think about it often now, what I would have done if I had known. Pulled the alarm, called the police, screamed for people to run away. But of course, nobody had any way of knowing what was about to happen. Oblivious to the peril I was putting myself in, I pushed open the doors for Theater 9 without giving it a second thought. The hallway in this theater was shaped like a U, and you could go either right or left. Theater 9 was the largest screening room in the building, perfect for accommodating those huge crowds that midnight premieres brought in. The screen was motionless and gray. Not even the previews had started yet. There was still a good hour and a half to go until the movie actually started. We entered on the right side, so all of the seats were to our left. I remember being surprised at just how packed the theater already was. Just about every seat was filled, much to our dismay. At first, it seemed like we wouldn't find a spot to sit together. Now, the way this theater was set up, there was a section of seats right in front of the screen. This area was flat. There were about 5 rows of seating in this section. A lot of the seats down there were empty, but sitting right in front of the movie screen sucks, and nobody wanted to sit there. One of my friends then spotted a row with 5 empty seats all right next to each other, perfect for the amount of people we had. These seats were about 3 to 4 rows up from where the seating rows started to elevate. We quickly ran up the stairs before someone could take the seats and filed in. My husband Brock sat in the 5th seat. I sat next to him. My friend Samantha sat next to me on my right side. Her boyfriend Tommy sat next to her, and another friend named Leo sat in the aisle seat. We spent the next several minutes casually chatting, joking around, and laughing. After a while, my 3 friends went to the lobby to buy drinks and that addicting movie theater popcorn. While they were gone, Brock and I passed the time by people watching. The theater was bright since the lights weren't dimmed yet, and I could see everyone clearly. There were a ton of people dressed in Batman t-shirts and hoodies. One person even had a mask and one of those shirts with an attached cape. There were a lot of kids in the audience as well, which wasn't surprising because even though it was a Thursday night, it was summer vacation. No school the next day. Of all the people I saw, the person I'll never forget was this real little girl sitting in our same row just a few chairs away. She was really cute, blonde with blue eyes. She passed us several times on her way to the lobby, each time coming back with various snacks and popcorn. Overall, people seemed very excited to see this movie. The room was filled with energy and laughter. After what seemed like an eternity of waiting, the lights finally started to dim, and the previews began. Just like every movie I'd seen before, a quick animation flashed across the screen, reminding us to get refreshments from the lobby. We were already devouring that popcorn like ravenous animals, to silence all our cell phones, and to make sure we knew where the emergency exits are. The animation had this ugly CGI cat in a tuxedo that was sitting in a movie theater. I quickly glanced at the bright green emergency exit signs that were on the left and right sides of the movie screen. I didn't think much of the reminder, as usual. After that, I only remember one preview for The Man of Steel. The others, I'm not quite sure what they were about. When the movie started, it erupted into cheering and clapping. The title of the movie, The Dark Knight Rises, exploded out onto the screen. This was followed by the scene where Bane is hijacking a plane. I thought this scene was pretty cool and it caught my interest right away. Only when the movie started to get a little less interesting did I remember just how tired I was. I decided I would close my eyes at the more boring parts to get a little bit of rest. I had been awake for a full 20 hours at that point, so I was rightfully sleepy. My eyes were closed for most of the duration of Batman and Catwoman's encounter. I don't really remember what was going on during that part of the movie. Anyway, I opened my eyes again, and Bruce Wayne was on his computer digging up information on Catwoman. That was the last scene I saw. I never got to watch the rest of the movie. All of a sudden, a loud bang erupted from the left side of the theater. I sort of screamed a little because it startled me. A strange smell started to fill the auditorium. It was like the smell of a firework. I thought maybe somebody had thrown a cherry bomb or something similar. Had someone thrown fireworks into the crowd as a prank? Then though, down near the right side of the movie screen, a dark silhouette of a person caught my attention. It was just a black frame against the bright movie screen. The series of flashing lights was coming from this person. It was this strange moment where time literally slowed down and everything went strangely quiet. I was completely frozen, unable to move and unable to comprehend what was happening. It was like my brain had stopped working entirely. Brock caught on immediately to what was happening though and grabbed me. He pulled me to the ground and laid down on top of me, shielding me with his own body. At this point in time, sound returned to me. I could hear gunshots ringing out across the theater. People were screaming. The movie was still playing on top of it all, creating a chaotic explosion of sound. I realized the flashing lights were the muzzle flash of a gun barrel. An instant sensation of adrenaline flooded my body, but there was absolutely nothing I could do except lay down and hope to God the bullets I heard tearing through the seats and walls wouldn't tear through me too. At one point, a piece of shrapnel hit my head, slicing off a good chunk of my hair, and as I reached for the spot to make sure it wasn't bleeding, hot pieces of metal fell into my hand. I was lying face up, so I could see everything that was happening. The lights from the still-playing movie danced across the ceiling and walls. My friends were on the floor with me. Our unfinished bucket of popcorn spilled across the floor. Leo had his legs sticking out into the aisle. There wasn't enough room for him to hide completely behind all the seats. At some point, Samantha's water bottle, which had been sitting in the cup holder between our seats, exploded. Water splashed all over my face. The smell of gun smoke was overwhelming. Riot-grade tear gas made me cry and caused me to cough uncontrollably. There was another smell too, the horrible metallic smell of blood that I'll never forget. I remember my lower body feeling wet all of a sudden. For some reason, I thought this came from the leaking water bottle, but I soon realized that wasn't the case. All of a sudden, things went strangely quiet. The bullets had stopped for some reason. Tommy shouted, "Let's get out of here!" We took advantage of the opportunity and made a run for it. We ran down the stairs across the front of the screen toward the bright green exit sign. We crammed into a small closet-like space where the door was. It was so dark we had a hard time finding it. We were screaming and slamming on the walls to find this door, blinded by tear gas and dumbfounded by shock. Finally, my hands felt the metal door handle, and I pushed in with all my strength. The door flew open, and the light of a nearby streetlight flooded our eyes. We pushed against the door so hard, we all fell out onto the concrete. Samantha lost her pink flip-flops just outside this doorway. I scrambled to my feet and literally ran for my life. I realized my legs were red, absolutely soaked with blood. It was like I had dipped my legs into a bathtub full of it. I checked all over my body and realized I wasn't injured at all. So where had all this blood come from? I looked behind me and realized the blood was my husband's. He had been shot right in the leg. There was a massive gaping hole ripped right through the lower half of Brock's right leg. His foot was barely hanging on and dangling lifelessly. Leo and a man I didn't recognize were carrying him, because after falling outside the door, he lost all his strength and couldn't even walk. I was completely shocked. I had no idea he had been injured, especially since he was right behind me the whole time and managed to escape by himself. How he did this on only one foot, I will never know. At this point, I screamed. My scream was so loud, it alerted nearby construction workers. At the back of the theater, there was a narrow parking lot, followed by a grassy lawn, and then the street beyond that. The construction workers were doing road repair, but as soon as they heard my scream and saw us running, they stopped working and watched what was going on. I'm not sure why this is such a vivid part of my memory. Anyway, they carried Brock along the back sidewalk all the way to the end, where the corner of the building is. That was quite a distance, several dozen feet. My husband then collapsed from exhaustion and pain, saying he couldn't move anymore. He laid down and a puddle of blood started forming beneath him. I looked back and realized we had left a huge trail leading from the door all the way to our current position. I was trembling. I knelt beside Brock and glanced around to see who else was injured. Tommy had been shot in the knee and the hip and was further away in the parking lot. The teenager who helped my husband was also injured. His dad and mom were with him. His mom was sitting against the wall and looked like she was going to pass out at any moment. She was bleeding from several places. That family had escaped at the same time as we did. We were all lucky though, because the shooting was still going on inside. I had to take off my shirt and use it to stop the bleeding. I'll never forget how lifeless and limp his leg felt. I imagine that's what a dead body must feel like. I got blood all over my hands and arms. The police showed up really fast. I'd say we were only outside for a minute or two before the red and blue sirens filled the night and rushed to our location. A female officer stood by us the whole time until paramedics arrived, which took a very long time. Brock was the last one to be taken to a hospital. He was bleeding out for almost 20 minutes before an ambulance pulled up on the same street with the road work. At this point, he had almost become unresponsive and was on the verge of unconsciousness. Several massive guys rushed across the grass with a stretcher, loaded him onto it, and then ran back with him to the waiting ambulance. I wasn't able to go with him because there was another injured person as well, and it was too crowded. I wandered around to the front of the theater alone, unsure of where my friends had gone. My blood-stained shirt and a pool of blood were left behind on the corner of that sidewalk. Walking through the crowds felt almost like a dream. I couldn't believe what had just happened. People were in hysterics and crying. A lot of people, such as me, were covered in blood, and like me, I'm pretty sure the blood staining their skin and clothes was not their own. A lot of people seemed to notice how lonely and dazed I looked, so they kept me company and even offered me a ride to different hospitals to find Brock. I hadn't been told where he was going. I hung around these people for a while as police swarmed the area and asked us what we saw inside the theater. The whole parking lot was on lockdown, and we weren't going to be allowed to leave anytime soon. It was around 2 a.m. and it was very dark outside still. I was pretty cold and wearing only an undershirt and shorts. The flashing red and blue lights of what seemed like 100 police cars were blinding. I remember seeing a big police vehicle pull up that said something like Crime Scene Investigation Unit on it. I think that's when it really sank in and hit me. I started to get sick to my stomach and wanted to vomit, but somehow I was able to hold it back. Eventually, police started letting people leave. I jumped into my truck and booked it out of there. I was in such a panic I didn't even think to go back to my apartment. I grabbed my cell phone and called my parents or anyone else to help me. I was angry, upset, scared, and most of all still in a state of shock. Was I really going to lose Brock only a month shy of our first wedding anniversary just because of some psychopath with a gun? Thankfully, by the time dawn rolled around, I found the hospital he was being treated in. It was the next city over, maybe 45 minutes from the theater if you're going the speed limit. I was so happy to be there, and the hospital staff were also welcoming and understanding. After making sure I wasn't injured as well, they let me wait in the ICU room that Brock would be placed in when he was done recovering from surgery. I was so glad he was alive. Brock and Tommy both had survived, though many others were not so lucky. I found out the following day that 12 people had been killed in this shooting, and 70 were injured. That little blonde girl I'd seen sitting in my row did not survive. She died in that theater no more than a few feet from us, shot multiple times. A heartbroken police officer who cried during his court testimony tried unsuccessfully to save her by carrying her out of the theater and having her sent to a hospital. Tommy had been rushed to a different one in the back of a police car. He underwent surgery and made a full recovery. The bullet missed his hip bone and narrowly missed his urinary tract and bladder. According to the surgeons, my husband lost almost half his blood. Luckily, he made it to the hospital in time. Any later and he would have died. He had to undergo several transfusions and was in the hospital for 21 days. The wound to his leg was severe enough that they had to amputate it after trying unsuccessfully to save it. It's been so long since the shooting happened that my husband, friends, and I have been able to recover from it somewhat. The event was pretty horrifying and has left us scarred for sure. I wouldn't consider that part of the story to be creepy though. No, the creepy part is the shooter himself. I later learned much about him from the murder trial that would follow in the coming years. Though my encounter with this man was very brief, he affected my life greatly. Just to know that people like this exist is disturbing. He certainly is one twisted individual I would never like to meet again. I learned everything from watching the televised trial that took place in early 2015. This guy was going to school for neuroscience or something in California. I guess he was a pretty smart guy. For some reason, though, he had an obsession with killing people and a stalker mentality. After dropping out of university, he moved to my state and chose my local theater to commit this shooting. Before that, he was planning on hiding along remote hiking trails in the mountains, jumping people, pulling them into the woods and killing them there, though he never went through with that idea. He'd staked out my theater for months and had this shooting all planned out for the night of July 20th. Though I never saw him before this, it's unnerving to think this guy could have been watching us every time we went there, and we would have never known. We were completely unaware of what he had planned against us. This completely ruined my sense of security, because who knows what the stranger next to you is planning on doing. I came very close to the shooter, but I never actually saw his face in person until I was forced to testify in court. Of course, I'd seen his mugshots on television, but while in the theater, I'd only seen him as a dark silhouette in the shadows, like some demonic figure rendered from the darkest and most sinister nightmare. He was even in the hallway that we passed upon running for the emergency exit. The only thing that stopped him from killing us right then and there was that he had jammed his assault rifle. To commit his crime, he ordered a few thousand rounds of ammunition, riot gear and armor, tear gas, an assault rifle, and a shotgun. He took pictures of himself which were shown in court, wearing all of this gear like some sort of sick trophy, holding up these weapons with a menacing smile. He dyed his hair orange and put in these creepy black contacts while making devilish faces into his camera, something that made me sick just looking at it. Before driving to the theater with all this gear in his car, he booby-trapped his entire apartment and set it to explode if anyone opened the door. Then, once at the theater, he posed as a moviegoer and even bought a ticket for the movie. I think his ticket had Theater 8 on it, which was next door, but Theater 9 had more people, so he went into that one instead. He was in the first front rows. I must have passed him several times in the lobby while he was there. Maybe he had seen me too. At some point during the movie, he got up and went through the side exit, which didn't have an alarm for some reason. He kept it propped open with something, then went to his car to put on all his armor and grabbed his weapons. Then he came back inside and started shooting. When we escaped the theater, we ran right past his white car, which had been parked right next to the exit. We didn't even notice it. At some point, he came outside, and he would have seen us there on the concrete. I don't know what stopped him from shooting the people who were out there too, but he could have easily ended us there and then if he wanted to. I think the hardest part about this for me was facing this man in court. I'll never forget rising as they called my name, walking down the center row past my family, other survivors, and crowds of news-hungry media personnel. I sat right across from him, maybe only 10 feet away. While his orange hair was gone, and he wasn't wearing black contacts, being close to him was a creepy and uncomfortable experience. My encounters with this man are ones I'll certainly never forget. I can now say I've come face to face with a true deranged psychopath. He just had this blank stare in his eyes the whole time. If eyes truly are the windows to the soul, then his soul was filled with nothing but a cold indifference for those he had murdered and harmed. He wouldn't even look at me. Sitting across from him in court was the second time I had knowingly been in the same room with this man. A man who tried to take my life but thankfully failed. A man who would end up spending forever behind bars, when at the end of it all, he was sentenced to 3,318 years in prison for his crimes. For 6 months last year, I lived in the north of Spain. About a week before I was going to move back to Ireland, my friend and I were at my house having dinner and drinking a bit. I was renting an apartment in the city, and my roommate was an older lady, maybe around her 50s, I think. I'm 20, by the way. That night, my roommate left to go have some dinner with her friends. About a minute after she left, someone buzzed our door to be let into the building. I looked at the camera and I didn't recognize the woman I saw. She looked to be in her late 20s to early 30s, so I assumed it must have been one of my roommate's friends, perhaps someone who was coming to meet her or something like that. I buzzed her into the building, assuming they would meet up in the lobby. At first, I didn't want to buzz her in because I didn't recognize her, and she'd walked away from the door. I hit the buzzer as soon as she walked away, and then I myself walked away from the camera, meaning I couldn't see if she'd actually entered or not. I assumed if she didn't, she would just call or text my roommate. Boy, was I wrong. This woman came straight up to my apartment building on the 6th floor. She came up just 2 minutes after my roommate left, so I know she didn't take the stairs. I know they must have seen each other when my roommate got off the lift, and that lady got in. Realizing this was quite weird, I didn't open the door when she came up and rang it. I looked out the peephole just to confirm, and from this close, I knew this was nobody I knew. At this point, I backed away from the door and gestured for my friend to be silent. We crept back to my room, which was at the far side of the apartment. I began to call my roommate, who was not picking up. Meanwhile, the lady was incessantly ringing my door. My roommate was still not answering. My friend was telling me to just open the door. In her mind, it was a woman, so she must be harmless. I told her she was an idiot for underestimating the female sex. I mean, women can be criminals too. She just kept telling me to open the door, and I refused. I could hear the door still ringing, so I crept out to look through the peephole. At this point, I understand that if she knew my roommate or was looking for someone in specific, she'd just call or text them. She didn't take out a phone at all though. She just stood there, eerily silent. Didn't call out any names or ask if anyone was home. This was so weird to me. I finally got through to my roommate. She said she wasn't expecting anyone and didn't know anyone in that age range. She became quite worried and asked if I was okay. I told her I would be fine. Now it had been at least 20 minutes. I know the lady knows someone is home because the lights are on, and my understanding is that's why she refused to leave. I continued to watch her through the peephole and saw her go into the lift for a minute, then sneak back out again. The lift is really loud, so I would have heard it move. It didn't though. She just went in and then came right back out. In my mind, this means someone in the lift was waiting for her. This all just screamed sketchy to me. After about 40 minutes, she finally left. I ran into our hall and flicked on the outside camera. The lady left the building with 2 men. They all had backpacks on. I'll be eternally grateful for trusting my instincts and not listening to my friend. Sometimes it's way better to be safe than sorry. When I was about 7 years old, my father bought a few hundred acres in southern Mississippi, about 1.5 hours west of Mobile, Alabama. He built a small cabin on top of a hill that was in the middle of a large field surrounded by woods. This house was about 5 miles from a paved road. To get to our land, it took nearly 10 minutes of driving down dirt roads from the main highway, which was just south of the house. About a quarter mile north from the house he built was a small lake, more like a pond really. It was about as long as a football field but slightly wider. To get to the lake from the house, you could take Route A, which was a hard-packed dirt road that was lined with dogwood trees. It was quite beautiful in the spring. Route B was about 100 yards east of Dogwood Lane. We named it Vampire Trail because it was always so gloomy. The trees blocked out the sun on the brightest days, and it had a slight decline as you walked toward the lake. I say walked because this trail was not made for vehicles. Thick woods filled the area outside and in between both trails. One morning during the fall, my parents and my little sister had gone to get ice cream and do some shopping. This trip would take them at least an hour or 2. I was 10 years old, so I decided to go fishing instead, while listening to Bama play Ole Miss. The game was the usual Bama win, so I thought I could ease the boredom of a blowout by fishing in the well-stocked lake. I carried my pole, my small radio, and my small ice chest. I had an Airedale Terrier named Bully that never left my side. It was on this day I realized just how awesome he really was. On to the lake we went. Picture a large oval, roughly the size of a football field but larger, with an L-shaped pier in the southeast corner. Vampire Lane opened up on a more severe decline to the shore, and then the small pier. Across the lake on the west side, there was a narrow tree line that separated the shore from Dogwood Lane. The north side of the lake was the dam, and the south ended in thick and swampy woods. Fortunately for me, I realized that later. About 5 minutes after I tossed out my line, and 2 Bama touchdowns later, I got that feeling. It's a feeling I've come to recognize well, and must have saved my life this day. The feeling of being watched by something dangerous. Bully must have felt it too, because only a few seconds later, I could hear him growling low and staring across the lake to the west, to the tree line that separated Dogwood Lane from the lake. I turned my head in that direction, and almost immediately my eyes lit on what I thought to be a half silhouette of a large man hiding behind a tree. I was too far out to make out the details, but close enough to be sure that's what I was seeing. About 5 minutes went by, and right before I'd scolded myself for an overactive imagination, the half silhouette began to sneak slowly. Bully stood and growled louder, and I told him quietly to stop. I turned my head north towards the dam, while keeping my eyes and attention rooted to that tree. Over the next 10 minutes, which felt like hours, I watched while this figure slowly snuck from tree to tree, always north and always facing me. The saying "scared stiff" was something I found to be true in that moment. For some reason, I thought it important that whoever or whatever it was did not know I was aware of them. I finally realized that the figure's path was bringing it closer to the dam, which would make its path to me shorter and easier. My paralysis finally broke. I put down my fishing pole and started towards Vampire Lane. As an adult, I was in the army for 11 years as an MP, but not turning to look over my shoulder during that entire walk was the hardest thing I have ever done. In my mind's eye, whatever it was must be screaming across the dam towards me right now. When I hit the tree line, I broke into a run. As I was running, Bully dashed ahead of me, and my anger turned into admiration as he stopped some 20 yards ahead and faced north until I passed by him. He continued this action my entire run home. My dog had my back, and it was just epic. Although I can grasp the awesomeness of this now, at the time I was so scared that I was literally sick. Even at such a young age, I knew that a large man watching and trying to creep on a 10-year-old boy was not up to any good. When I reached the cabin, I immediately locked the door and got one of my dad's shotguns, as well as his .38 revolver. I sat at the large front window, my eyes glued to both trail openings and the woods between them. My family returned shortly after, and for some reason I didn't tell them about what happened. I never felt safe there again. When me and my friends or my little sister wanted to go anywhere other than the area around the cabin, I made sure my parents were always with us. What scares me the most, though, is the fact that our closest neighbors were 2 miles northwest of us, with thick woods in between as the crow flies. Who or what the hell was watching me from the woods that day? I guess I may never know. I sometimes wish I could go back then, as a grown man with military training, as I am now. Bully lived a full life and was put to sleep peacefully as a very old but great dog. The best dog I've ever known, really. When I was 19 in the early 90s, my brother and his wife were newly married and living out in Baltimore. I was from Maryland, but I had not yet spent any time in that city. I knew it wasn't totally safe in parts, but I also knew that I was just going straight to my brother and sister-in-law's house, so surely it would be fine. Until I accidentally turned onto the wrong street. This was Martin Luther King Boulevard. Back then, it was a stretch of abandoned gas stations, sketchy bars, boarded-up houses. A few people were walking in the middle of the street drinking out of paper bags. I knew immediately I had messed up. Instead of freaking out and getting more lost, though, I pulled over to an abandoned gas station. There was a bank of payphones, and I parked about 10 feet from them, hopped out, and called my brother. He was impatient at first because he knew the city quite well. It was my first time driving in it, though, and I was trying to write down his directions as he gave them to me. Just then, something caught my eye. I looked over at my car. I saw 3 men were leaning against it, 2 on the passenger side, 1 against the driver's side front door. They were all staring at me with their arms crossed. I started to silently cry, thankful I had sunglasses on. My brother heard me sniffling. "Why are you upset? I'm giving you directions right now." I couldn't tell him what was going on, though. The men were all within earshot. I got the rest of the directions, put them into my pocket, and walked over to my car. The man leaning against the door reached up and wiped the tears from one cheek. Then he said, "Why you crying, baby? Nothing bad has happened yet." Without even thinking about it, I responded, fully sobbing now. "I just shot my boyfriend and I'm in a lot of trouble. The cops are..." That's all I managed to get out. The 3 men had all taken off in separate directions at full sprints away from me. If I hadn't been gifted that lie from my guardian angels, or whatever saved my ass by putting it into my brain that day, who knows what might have happened to me. This story took place when I was 23 years old, close to 10 years ago. I was living in upstate New York in a very rural area with my ex-boyfriend and his family. He and I used to argue quite a bit, actually. One morning before he went to work, he and I got into a very heated argument. He was 20 years my senior, but during this particular fight he acted majorly juvenile. He jumped out of bed, flipped me the bird, and yelled, "If you don't like it so much, why don't you go back to the fucking Bronx or something?" That was all the prompting I needed. I threw on my Uggs and my winter jacket, grabbed my cigarettes, and flew out of the house. I'm unfortunately an impulsive ass and didn't think to grab my cell phone before I'd stormed out. I didn't drive at the time, so my only option really was to walk. I don't think at that time I intended to fully walk back to the Bronx, as I was a 3-hour car ride upstate, but I just needed to go for my angry, dramatic walk. I realized once I got to this road at the entrance of the trailer park that I had no idea where anything really was around me. I'd only lived there for a few months at that point, and we didn't exactly go out a lot. I banked left and just walked and walked where I knew civilization was. I found myself walking alongside a very busy stretch of road, with 18-wheelers flying by, spraying me with slushy snow and soaking my shoes. I saw my then boyfriend driving by on his way to work as he sped up and drove right past me, evidently still quite angry about our fight. I thought for sure he was going to turn around at some point, but he just never came back. I pressed on, deciding instead to try to walk to my best friend's mother's house, which I knew to be in the same town. It started to snow though, and I was quickly losing my momentum. I passed by a VFW, where a nondescript pickup truck was parked in the driveway. It wasn't until I had passed it that I even realized the driver was still in the front seat. He called out to me, "Hey honey, do you need help?" My stomach churned, realizing I would have to accept this stranger's offer. I approached his truck slowly and tried to weigh out my options. He was clean-cut, seemingly normal, and an older white guy. Gray hair, greenish-blue eyes, just really average. I don't know why, but in that moment I blurted out, "Are you a good guy or a bad guy?" I cringed at myself for asking such a dumb question. I'm a good guy. I wouldn't tell you if I was a bad guy either, you know. I ignored the bells going off in my head and got in the front seat with him. As we drove, I realized I had no clue where my friend's mom actually lived. I knew the name of the road she lived on, but it spanned a good distance, so it wasn't very helpful in terms of finding my actual destination. I asked to borrow his cell phone so I could try calling my best friend to ask her where the fuck I was supposed to be going. I called her 3 times and she didn't answer because she didn't recognize the number. I started to feel inexplicably hopeless. After a few minutes, he asked me where I was from and why I was out in the middle of nowhere in the snow wearing only pajamas. I explained I was originally from the Bronx and had gotten into a fight with my boyfriend. He paused. "Hey, you wouldn't be interested in making a little money, would you?" I chuckled nervously. "Oh, no thanks though." "Well, I just figured since you said you were from the Bronx." Realizing at that point I was definitely in some deep shit, I muttered, "Oh, sure." He eyed me up and down and laughed to himself before sneering. Sure, she says. I started to panic big time, but I knew I couldn't show my fear. I scoured the scenery for a pillowy snowbank I could land in if I leapt out of the truck, but there was no avail. The houses now were so few and far between, I became certain this would be how I met my demise. I'll never know why, but it was at this point that he decided to ask me who I was going to see. I quickly blurted out my best friend's mom's name, and her husband's name as well. He instantly perked up and explained he knew the husband, how they used to snowmobile together 20 years ago. I felt the greatest wave of relief when he explained that he knew exactly where his old buddy lived. When we finally pulled up to that big yellow house, it was like arriving in the promised land. I sheepishly asked his name, Steve. Then he asked mine. I gave him a fake name, spat out a bullshit thank you, and ran as fast as I could from his truck to the porch. I crashed through the front door and locked it behind me. I immediately started crying and running through the house trying to find my friend's mom. I had awoken her from a sound sleep. but she didn't say a word about it upon seeing how shaken up I was. Once I knew I was safe with her, I explained everything. The fight, the fleeing, the weird guy and his sexual proposition. She listened, horrified and curious at the same time. She made me promise to never do anything so reckless again, and that instead, if I needed, to call her. She told me she would ask her husband when he got home about this Steve guy and find out more about him. I returned to my boyfriend's later that same day and got really stoned to try and forget about the events of that morning. The following day, my friend's mom called me to tell me that Steve was a dangerous person who her husband had cut off communication with years ago. Last he had heard, he had been arrested for a sexual assault. She then went on to point out how incredibly easy it would have been for him to hurt me and leave me just about anywhere on some lonely stretch of road. No one would even know where to look for me. Not to mention, I might have never been found until the snow thawed out. Upon sharing this, the best friend of mine mentioned in this story reminded me I'd left out a super unsettling detail. When her mom called, she was able to tell me Steve's last name. One of the first results on Google with his name plus the town's name brought me straight to a registered sex offender website with a mugshot of him. His eyes looked cold and empty, and I realized with him being on probation at that time, he would have been especially eager to not have me get him in any further trouble with the law. Her mom said it best when she told me I must have had some serious guardian angels looking out for me that day. I'll start by saying I have a terrible biological father. He's been a shady person all my life and constantly caused me a lot of grief. This is just one of those examples. When I was 4, my parents split up. My mother and I moved states, and they agreed I would visit my dad every school holiday for a week. This one particular time, I had been with him for a few days when I was playing with my cousin at a nearby park. A car pulled up alongside us, and I recognized the man inside as one of my dad's friends. He called me over, and without even thinking, I ran over to him and left my cousin there at the park. He asked me if I could show him where my dad lived, and I agreed happily and got into his car. I gave directions and didn't notice at all that the person wasn't following them correctly. Looking back, I really didn't know the way myself anyhow. After way too long, I did realize we were getting closer to the city, which was far away from my dad's house. We pulled up at a home I didn't recognize, and the man told me to wait in the car. I did and didn't feel scared at all for some reason. He eventually took me inside, and I definitely started to feel unsafe then. I mainly remember 2 girls passed out with their tops off, and a much older man that was feeling them up everywhere. I made eye contact with this man, and it made me sick to my stomach. I definitely figured out I was in a bad situation at this point. A lady took me into a bedroom and brought me a sandwich. The bread was stale and I wasn't very hungry, but I ate it because I felt very bad for her. It doesn't make a lot of sense, I guess, but that's what I was thinking at the time. The lady told me a lot of things I didn't quite understand, but when she left, I remember thinking my dad was coming to pick me up soon. I fell asleep waiting for him. I wet the bed that night and no one came to see me the next day until I cried very loudly and started banging on the door. That lady came back and yelled at me for stinking up her bedroom, and I asked about my dad. She said he was coming tonight after he finished work. She didn't offer me a shower or a bath, so I just sat there in my soiled pants all day. After that, everything turned into a blur really. My dad did not come that night. I was so terrified. In my head, it felt like I was trapped there for months. I thought I was missing school and everyone must have forgotten about me. In reality, I was only there for 5 days. They let me take 1 shower. I don't remember eating much except for boring sandwiches. I think I had chips and gravy once as well. Finally, my mom drove across the country to come and get me. After not being able to get a hold of me or my dad for so long and me missing my pre-booked flight home, she panicked and came looking for me. Thank God she did. She found my dad at his girlfriend's house, methed out completely and hiding out. Turns out he owed a lot of drug money to the people who had taken me. They had told him that they had me, but he couldn't afford to get me back. Or maybe he didn't want me back. Whatever it was, he didn't even bother to try. My amazing mom paid his debt for him after borrowing from a lot of people, and she came to get me back. I remember when someone came into that room and told me my mom was here. I walked out and I could smell her. It was the best feeling to feel safe again. She took me home and I didn't see my dad again for a very long time. She never called the police. My parents' relationship was very complicated then, and I fully understand the choices she made. I definitely am okay now though. I've spoken about this in therapy, and I've come to terms with most of the things that I went through as a child. Still, it's a fucked up situation for a 4-year-old girl to have to be in.